The day my father told me I couldn't live with them anymore, I was 14 years old. The kitchen smelled of pancakes and betrayal, and his words hung in the air like poison. "Addison, we think it would be best if you went to live with Aunt Carol," he said, not meeting my eyes. I stared at him, my fork suspended midway to my mouth. Beside him, Jeanette, my stepmother of 8 months, gave me a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why?" I managed to whisper. My father cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his coffee mug. "The baby's coming in a few months. We need the space." And Jeanette thinks, he hesitated, glancing at his new wife, "we think a fresh start would be good for everyone." "A fresh start," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Without me." "Don't be dramatic, Addison," Jeanette sighed, resting her manicured hand on her slightly rounded belly. "It's just that babies need a lot of attention. And you'll be happier with Carol. She doesn't have children of her own." Like I was a puppy being rehomed. "What about Mom's things?" I asked, my voice cracking. "The boxes in the attic, photo albums, her vintage record collection, the jewelry she'd wanted me to have when I turned 16. What about her room?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's the thing. We're converting your mother's old office into the nursery. And your room will make a perfect home office for Derek," Jeanette added, as if she were telling me I'd won a prize instead of being evicted from my own home. I felt something break inside me then, not just crack, but shatter. My mother had been dead for less than 2 years. Her perfume still clung to the clothes in her closet. And now they were erasing her. Erasing me. "When?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was collapsing. "This weekend," my father replied. "Carol's already preparing the guest room for you." The rest of that day blurred together, packing my life into suitcases, deciding which pieces of myself to bring and which to leave behind. My father helped, moving robotically around my childhood bedroom, avoiding my eyes. Jeanette stayed downstairs, occasionally calling up questions about what to do with this or that. As if my belongings were already inconvenient obstacles to her perfect new life. That night, I crept into my mother's closet one last time. I buried my face in her favorite sweater, breathing in the fading scent of her. "Mom," I whispered into the darkness, "I don't know what to do." But my mother, with her warm laugh and fierce love, was gone. And now, it seemed, so was my father. 3 days later, I stood in Aunt Carol's driveway, watching my father's car disappear around the corner. He hadn't even come inside, just helped unload my things, given me an awkward side hug, and fled back to his new family. "Well," Aunt Carol said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "let's get you settled." Carol was my mother's older sister, tall, angular, and perpetually single. She lived in a neat colonial house in a town 30 miles away from everything I'd ever known. She wasn't unkind, just unpracticed in the art of raising a teenage girl. She tried, in her way, setting up my room with new bedding and a desk for studying. "It'll be an adjustment," she told me that first night, as we ate takeout Chinese food at her small kitchen table. "But we'll figure it out together." I nodded, pushing rice around my plate. "Thanks for taking me in." Carol's face softened. "Addison, you're not some stray cat. You're my niece. This is where you belong now." But I didn't belong there. I didn't belong anywhere. My father had discarded me like outgrown clothes, making space in his life for his new wife and their perfect, unborn child. And in the years that followed, he made it clear just how complete his new family was without me. My name is Addison Mercer, and this is the story of how I rebuilt my life after being forgotten, and what happened when those who abandoned me suddenly remembered I existed. Carol's guest room became my room. Her house became my house. And somewhere along the way, my anger hardened into determination. While my father sent obligatory birthday cards with impersonal gift cards enclosed, I threw myself into school. I joined every club, took every honors class, studied until my eyes burned. Carol, who'd spent her life pursuing academic excellence as a professor of literature, watched with a mixture of approval and concern. "You don't have to prove anything, Addison," she said one night, finding me still awake at 2 a.m., hunched over calculus problems. "I'm not proving anything," I replied, not looking up. "I'm building something. A future. A life. An escape." It worked. By my senior year, I had college acceptance letters from 7 universities, including a full scholarship to Cornell. When the letter arrived, Carol took me out for dinner, the fancy Italian place downtown that we usually reserved for special occasions. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, raising her wine glass. "I know I am." I smiled, feeling a bittersweet pang. "Do you think my father will be?" Carol's expression tightened. "If he isn't, he's a bigger fool than I already think he is." I'd seen my father exactly 14 times in the 4 years since he'd dropped me at Carol's house. Perfunctory holiday visits that grew shorter each year. Awkward dinners where Jeanette talked endlessly about my half-siblings, first Thomas, then the twins, Emma and Ellie. My father always seemed relieved when these visits ended, like he'd completed an unpleasant obligation. I emailed him about Cornell. He responded 3 days later, "Congratulations. Let us know if you need anything for the dorm. Not we're proud of you. Not we'll miss you. Certainly not I'm sorry for abandoning you when you needed me most." But I didn't need him anymore. I had Carol, who'd gone from awkward guardian to fierce advocate. I had my friends, especially Maya, who knew every detail of my abandonment and still believed I was worth keeping. And I had my future, bright and beckoning, far away from the remnants of my old life. The summer before college, I worked 2 jobs, mornings at the local coffee shop, evenings waitressing at the steakhouse on Main Street. I was saving for a car, determined to be completely independent. One sticky June evening, I was clearing tables when I heard a familiar voice that made me freeze. "Addison? Is that you?" I turned slowly, balancing a tray of dirty plates, to find my father standing there. He looked older, grayer, a slight paunch straining his golf shirt. Behind him stood Thomas, now 7 years old, staring at me curiously. "Hi, Dad," I said, professional smile firmly in place. "Table for 2? He seemed taken aback by my poise. "Yes, please. I didn't know you worked here." "For almost a year now," I replied, leading them to a booth by the window. "Carol didn't mention it?" My father shifted uncomfortably. "We, don't talk much these days." No shit, I thought, but I just nodded and handed them menus. "Your server will be right over." As I turned to leave, my father caught my wrist. "Wait. Sit with us for a minute? Tommy, this is your big sister." The boy regarded me suspiciously. "Mom says you live somewhere else because you don't like us." My blood ran cold. I pulled my arm from my father's grasp. "That's not true," I said, looking directly at my father. "I live with Aunt Carol because your parents decided they didn't have room for me when you were born." My father flinched. "Addison, that's not exactly." "My break's over," I said, cutting him off. "Enjoy your dinner." I spent the rest of my shift in a haze of memory and rage. By closing time, they were long gone, leaving a too large tip and a hastily scrawled note on the back of the receipt: "We should talk before you leave for school." I crumpled it and threw it away. Carol was reading in her favorite armchair when I got home, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She looked up as I dropped onto the couch. "Rough night?" she asked. Dad came in. "With Thomas." I kicked off my shoes, curling my legs under me. "Apparently Jeanette told the kids I don't live with them because I don't like them." Carol removed her glasses, her expression darkening. "That woman has always been a piece of work." "She got what she wanted," I said bitterly. "Dad all to herself. Her perfect little family." "Not so perfect, from what I hear," Carol murmured. I glanced up sharply. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "It's just rumors. Derek's been spending a lot of time at the office. Jeanette's always at those charity events alone. The usual midlife crisis indicators." A mean part of me felt satisfied. The rest just felt empty. "I don't care," I declared, but even to my own ears, it sounded hollow. Carol gave me a knowing look. "It's okay to care, Addison. It's also okay to protect yourself from people who've hurt you." I nodded, suddenly exhausted. "I'm going to bed." "Addison," Carol called as I reached the stairs. "For what it's worth, your father made the biggest mistake of his life when he let you go." I smiled weakly. "Thanks, Carol." "I mean it," she said firmly. "And someday, he's going to realize it too." I went to bed that night thinking about my father's aging face, my half-brother's suspicious eyes, and Carol's cryptic comment. I didn't want my father to realize what he'd lost. I didn't want him to regret his choices. I wanted him to disappear completely from my heart, leaving no tender spots, no vulnerabilities. But hearts don't work that way, no matter how much we wish they would. Cornell was everything I'd hoped for: challenging, exhilarating, far from the shadows of my past. I double majored in business and computer science, joined the entrepreneurship club, and spent my summers interning at tech companies. I rarely went home, preferring to spend breaks exploring new cities or working extra hours. Carol understood, visiting me instead. The Christmas of my junior year, I reluctantly agreed to a family dinner at my father's house, the same house where I'd grown up, now transformed by Jeanette's taste for beige minimalism and shabby chic furnishings. My mother's vibrant art was gone, replaced by generic prints. The kitchen, once a warm space of copper pots and family recipes, now gleamed with unused appliances and granite countertops. "Addie's home." Thomas crowed when I arrived, using the nickname he'd invented despite meeting me only a handful of times. The twins, now 6, hung back shyly, but he grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the living room. "Come see the tree." I let myself be dragged along, ignoring the awkward tension between Carol and Jeanette. The tree was impressive, professionally decorated in silver and blue, with perfectly coordinated ornaments. "Where are all the old decorations?" I asked, looking for the handmade ornaments my mother and I had collected over the years: the clay star I'd made in 2nd grade, the glass icicles from our trip to Germany. My father cleared his throat. "We went with a different theme this year." "We went with a different theme 7 years ago," Jeanette corrected, her voice brittle. "The old decorations were dated. Mom let us throw them away," Thomas added helpfully. "She said they were tacky." Something in me that had been barely holding together splintered. "Those weren't yours to throw away," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "They were my mother's. They were mine." The room fell silent. Thomas retreated, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. The twins huddled together on the couch, wide-eyed. "Addison," my father began, but I cut him off. "No, Dad. You don't get to Addison me. You gave away my home, my room, and now I find out you've thrown away the last pieces of my mother? For what? So your new wife could have a color-coordinated Christmas?" Jeanette's face flushed. "I think you're being dramatic. They were just old decorations." "They weren't just decorations to me," I said, my voice breaking. "They were memories. They were all I had left of her." I turned to my father, who looked stricken. "Did you save anything of hers? Anything at all? Or did you just erase her completely?" The guilty flash in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. "I can't do this," I said, grabbing my coat. "I'm sorry, Thomas, girls. It was nice to see you, but I have to go." "Addison, wait," my father called, following me to the door. "Please, let me explain." I turned back, tears streaming down my face. "What's there to explain? You chose them. You always choose them. You shipped me off like unwanted baggage, and now you've thrown away the last pieces of my mother like she never existed. Like I never existed." Carol appeared beside me, her arm steady around my shoulders. "We're leaving, Derek. Don't call us. We'll call you when we're ready." In the car, I broke down completely. Carol drove in silence, letting me cry until I had no tears left. "I'm sorry," I finally whispered, as we pulled into her driveway. "Don't you dare apologize," she said fiercely. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I ruined Christmas." "No, honey. They ruined Christmas a long time ago." She turned to face me. "But we're not going to let them ruin any more holidays. From now on, we make our own traditions." And we did. That night, we ordered Chinese food and watched classic movies. The next day, we went to the storage unit Carol had quietly maintained, where she showed me boxes of my mother's things she'd rescued before my father could dispose of them: photo albums, journals, the jewelry meant for my 16th birthday that I'd never received. "I couldn't save everything," she admitted. "But I got what mattered most." I hugged her tightly. "Thank you. For everything." After that Christmas, I stopped trying to maintain a relationship with my father. I turned down invitations for birthdays and holidays. I didn't call. I didn't visit. I graduated summa cum laude without telling him, though Carol, beaming with pride in the audience, sent him photos afterwards. I moved to New York, accepted a job at a promising tech startup, and built a life that had nothing to do with the family that had discarded me. By 25, I was leading my own team. By 27, I'd launched my own company, Mira Technologies, specializing in AI solutions for healthcare. By 30, I was being featured in business magazines as one of the tech world's rising stars. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my carefully constructed world collided with the past I'd tried so hard to leave behind. The call came as I was leaving a meeting with potential investors. Unknown number, but with my hometown area code. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something, intuition, perhaps, made me answer. "Addison Mercer speaking." "Addison?" A young male voice, hesitant and vaguely familiar. "It's Thomas. Your brother." I paused in the lobby of the sleek downtown high-rise, my heart racing. "Thomas. Is everything okay?" "No," he said, his voice breaking. "Dad's in the hospital. He had a heart attack. It's bad." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. How bad? They're not sure if he's going to make it. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. He's asking for you. Memories flashed through my mind, my father teaching me to ride a bike, reading bedtime stories, holding me after my mother died. Then later memories, the cold detachment as he helped me pack, the awkward visits that grew more infrequent, the betrayal of the discarded Christmas ornaments. Addison? Are you there? I swallowed hard. Yes. I'm here. I'll get there as soon as I can. Within hours, I was on a plane back to the place I'd fought so hard to escape. Back to the family that had made it clear I wasn't wanted. Carol met me at the airport, her face lined with worry. You didn't have to come, she said, but her eyes said she was glad I had. I know, I replied, sliding into the passenger seat of her familiar sedan. But I would have regretted it if he died, I couldn't say. Even after everything, the thought was unbearable. He's stable for now, Carol informed me as we drove toward the hospital. Jeanette's been there all night. The kids are with her sister. And you? Have you been to see him? Carol's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Briefly. He was sedated. We rode in silence for a while, the familiar landscapes of my childhood passing by outside the window. I'd built a fortress around my heart, brick by painful brick, but I could feel it beginning to crumble. I hate that I still care, I admitted softly. Carol reached over, squeezing my hand. That's because you have a good heart, Addison. Even if they didn't deserve it. The hospital was a modern facility on the outskirts of town, all glass and steel. As we approached the cardiac unit, I saw Jeanette in the waiting area, looking haggard in rumpled clothes, her usually perfect hair falling limply around her face. She looked up as we approached, and for a moment, naked hostility flashed in her eyes. You came, she said flatly. Thomas called me, I replied, equally cold. Of course he did. She shook her head, as if disappointed in my half-brother's actions. He's always had a soft spot for you, even though you've been virtually non-existent in his life. I bit back a harsh retort, reminding myself why I was here. How is my father? Stable, she said, her voice clipped. The doctor said the next 24 hours are critical. Can I see him? Jeanette's mouth twisted. He's asked for you several times. I suppose I can't stop you. I followed her down the corridor, past rooms filled with beeping machines and hushed conversations. The antiseptic smell brought back painful memories of my mother's final days, but I pushed them aside. My father looked small in the hospital bed, tethered to machines that monitored his weakened heart. His skin had a grayish tinge, and the vibrant man of my childhood seemed to have vanished, replaced by this fragile shell. Addison. His voice was barely a whisper. You came. I moved closer, uncertain what to do or say. This man had broken my heart more thoroughly than anyone else ever could. He had discarded me when I needed him most. And yet, seeing him like this, vulnerable, afraid, I couldn't summon the anger that had sustained me for so long. Thomas called me, I said, awkwardly taking the chair beside the bed. My boy, he murmured, a ghost of a smile passing over his lips. Always the peacemaker. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Behind me, I could feel Jeanette hovering in the doorway. The doctors say I need surgery, my father finally said. They're not sure. Don't. I shook my head. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. He reached for my hand, his fingers cool and dry against my skin. I've been a terrible father to you, Addie. The childhood nickname, and used for so many years, sent a pang through my chest. I've made so many mistakes, he continued, his voice strengthening slightly. I let Jeanette come between us. I let her push you out. I was weak, and you paid the price. Behind me, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Derek, you need to rest, Jeanette said quickly, stepping into the room. No. My father's voice was surprisingly firm. I need to say this. I've been a coward for too long. He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes filled with tears. Addison, can you ever forgive me? I sat frozen, caught between the past and present, between the hurt child I'd been and the woman I'd become. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him it was too late, that some wounds can never heal. But another part, the part that still remembered being carried on his shoulders, still treasured the sound of his laugh, couldn't bear to deny him this peace. I don't know, I said honestly. I want to. But it's not that simple. He nodded, tears slipping down his pale cheeks. I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted what I did to you. What I allowed to happen. Jeanette made a sound of protest. Derek, that's not fair. We did what was best for everyone. Best for whom? I asked, turning to look at her. Best for you, certainly. But not for me. And, I suspect, not really for him either. You have no idea what our marriage has been like, she snapped. What I've had to deal with. Jeanette, my father murmured. Please. Not now. She glared at both of us, then stormed out, the door closing harder than necessary behind her. I'm sorry, my father said softly. For everything. I nodded, unsure what to say. You should rest. Will you come back tomorrow? He asked, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion. I'll be here, I promised, and was surprised to find I meant it. In the hall, I found Jeanette pacing, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Happy now, she hissed. Swooping in like some prodigal daughter, making him feel guilty when he's at his weakest. I didn't come to fight, I said, suddenly tired of the old battles. I came because my father might be dying. Your father. She laughed bitterly. You disappeared from his life for years, and now suddenly you care? I disappeared? I stared at her incredulously. You kicked me out of my own home when I was 14 years old. You turned my father against me. You threw away my mother's things like they were garbage. And yet somehow I'm the villain in this story? Jeanette's face paled. I did what I had to do to protect my family. I was his family too, I said quietly. I was there first. I left her standing there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. As I walked away, I felt lighter somehow, as if speaking my truth had loosened a burden I'd carried for far too long. Carol was waiting in the lobby, leafing through an old magazine. She looked up as I approached. How is he? She asked. Weak. Remorseful. I sank into the chair beside her. He asked for my forgiveness. And? I shrugged. I told him I didn't know if I could give it. Carol nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's fair. Forgiveness isn't something you can force, Addison. It has to come naturally, if it comes at all. The thing is, I said slowly, I think I want to forgive him. Not for his sake, but for mine. I'm tired of carrying this anger. Then that's your answer, Carol said simply. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it certainly doesn't mean letting them hurt you again. I leaned my head against her shoulder, grateful for her unwavering support. When did you get so wise? She chuckled. Somewhere between raising a brilliant, stubborn niece and watching my fool of a brother-in-law ruin the best thing in his life. We sat there in comfortable silence, the hospital bustling around us. Tomorrow would bring more difficult conversations, more confrontations with the past. But for now, I was content to sit with the one person who had never let me down, who had picked up the pieces when my world shattered. "Let's go home," Carol said finally. "You need rest." Home. Not the house where I'd grown up, not the place where my mother's memory had been systematically erased. But Carol's house, the place where I'd rebuilt myself, piece by painful piece. As we drove through the quiet streets, I felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. My father might not survive this crisis. Our relationship might never fully heal. But I had faced the past today, and I had survived. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the same strength that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. My father survived the night. And the surgery that followed. And the grueling recovery process. During those weeks, I extended my stay, working remotely from Carol's house, making daily trips to the hospital. Thomas and the twins, now 13 and 12, growing into their own personalities, visited often. I got to know them properly for the first time, beyond the awkward holiday encounters of the past. Thomas was thoughtful and bookish, reminding me painfully of my younger self. The twins were as different as sisters could be, Emma serious and logical, Ellie creative and effervescent. They circled me cautiously at first, but soon began peppering me with questions about New York, about my company, about the life I'd built without them. "Why don't you ever visit?" Ellie asked one afternoon, as we shared vending machine snacks in the waiting room. I considered sugarcoating it, then decided against it. They deserved honesty. "Because it hurt too much," I said simply. "Being around your parents reminded me of what I'd lost." "Dad said he made mistakes," Thomas offered, his young face solemn. "He said he should have been a better father to you." I nodded, surprised by his maturity. "He did make mistakes. Big ones. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you." "Do you hate us?" Emma asked bluntly. "No," I said, surprised by the question. "I've never hated you." "How could I? None of this was your fault." "But Mom said, your mother and I have very different perspectives," I interrupted gently. "But you should know that I've always wanted to know you better. I just didn't know how." As my father slowly recovered, our conversations grew deeper. He spoke of his regrets, his shame, the slow disintegration of his second marriage. Jeanette, he confessed, had begun talking about divorce months before his heart attack, their relationship strained by financial troubles and her growing resentment of his guilt over how they'd treated me. "She was jealous of your mother's memory," he admitted during one of our talks. "Of your place in my heart. She thought if she could erase all traces of your mother, she could erase my grief too." "That doesn't excuse what she did," I said. "What you both did." "No," he agreed sadly. "Nothing excuses that." One rainy afternoon, when we were alone in his hospital room, he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Will you ever be able to let me back into your life, Addie?" I looked at him, this broken man who had once been my hero, who had failed me so completely, and who now sought redemption. "I don't know what that would look like," I said honestly. "I've built a life without you. I can't just pretend the past didn't happen." "I understand," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But," I continued, "I'm willing to try. Not for your sake, but for mine. And for Thomas and the girls." A spark of hope lit his tired eyes. "Really?" "Small steps," I cautioned. "I'm not moving back." I'm not giving up my life in New York. But maybe, phone calls. Visits sometimes. Getting to know the kids better. He nodded eagerly. Anything. Whatever you're comfortable with. And Jeanette? I asked, the final hurdle. She's made it clear she doesn't want me around. My father's expression hardened. Jeanette doesn't get to make that decision anymore. Not about you, not about the children. 2 days later, as I was leaving the hospital after a brief visit, I found Jeanette waiting by my car. Her arms were crossed defensively, but her expression was less hostile than usual. We need to talk, she said. I think we've said everything that needs saying, I replied, unlocking my door. Please. The words seemed to cost her. Just hear me out. I sighed, leaning against the car. Fine. Talk. She took a deep breath. I know I can't undo what happened. I know I hurt you deeply. But I need you to understand, I was young and insecure. I felt like I was competing with a ghost. My mother wasn't a ghost, I said coldly. She was a person. A person who loved me. Who would never have abandoned her child for a new relationship. Jeanette flinched. I deserve that. But Addison, the kids need you in their lives. Especially now. I studied her face, searching for the manipulation I'd come to expect. But all I saw was exhaustion and something that might have been regret. Why now? I asked. After all these years, why do you suddenly care about my relationship with them? Because they ask about you, she said simply. All the time. Thomas has been following your career for years. The girls have a photo of you that they got from your father's wallet. They know you're successful and smart and everything I've tried not to be, and they admire you for it. I wasn't prepared for the rush of emotion her words triggered. The thought of my half-siblings keeping tabs on me, caring about me despite the distance I'd maintained, struck a chord I hadn't known existed. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. But I can try to build something with them. For their sake. She nodded, seeming to understand that it was the best she could hope for. Thank you. As she walked away, I felt the last pieces of my anger begin to dissolve, not into forgiveness, exactly, but into something less consuming, less destructive. The day my father was discharged from the hospital, I helped Thomas and the twins decorate Carol's house for a small welcome home party. We hung streamers and blew up balloons, and Carol baked his favorite chocolate cake. It wasn't perfect, Jeanette declined to attend, sending the children alone, but it was a beginning. As I watched my father's face light up at the sight of his 4 children together, I felt something shift inside me. The wound would always be there, a scar on my heart. But perhaps it didn't have to define me anymore. Later that evening, as Carol and I washed dishes together, she nodded toward the living room, where my father was playing a board game with the kids. You've given him more than he deserves, she said quietly. Maybe, I agreed. But I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for me. And for them. Carol smiled, her eyes suspiciously bright. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. The mention of my mother, so often a painful subject, felt different now. Less like an open wound, more like a bittersweet memory. I know, I said softly. She taught me what it means to love unconditionally. Even when it's hard. 3 days later, I boarded a plane back to New York, back to the life I'd built. But this time, I carried with me 3 new phone numbers, promises of video calls, and tentative plans for the kids to visit over spring break. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if these fragile new connections would last. But I knew that I was no longer defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I'd built: a successful career, a loving relationship with Carol, and now, perhaps, a new kind of family that included the siblings I'd never really known. As the plane lifted off, I thought about the 14-year-old girl who'd been discarded like an inconvenient puzzle piece that no longer fit. I wished I could tell her that she would survive. That she would thrive. That she would eventually find a kind of peace that neither erased the past nor remained trapped by it. My name is Addison Mercer, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes, the family you build is stronger than the family you're born into. And sometimes, forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about refusing to let it determine your future.